He thought he was the one in control, until the moment control quietly slipped out of his hands. The station smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paperwork, the kind of place where time moved slowly but judgment moved fast. Fluorescent lights humming overhead as officers drifted in and out with casual authority. Their conversations low, their laughter sharper than it should have been, and in the middle of it all sat a woman no one paid much attention to, at least not at first. Ava Carter kept her posture straight, hands resting calmly in front of her, her expression unreadable but not empty. She wasn't nervous, not even slightly. She was observing, absorbing every detail, every voice, every glance that lingered a second too long. And if you were standing there, watching the scene unfold, you might have thought she was just another civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But there was something about the way she held herself, something steady, something unshaken, like she already knew how this would end. And across the room, leaning against a desk with the ease of someone who had never been questioned in his life, stood Officer Daniel Brooks, tall, confident, the kind of man who carried his badge like it was more than metal, like it was permission. His voice cut through the room as he spoke, not loud, but sharp enough to turn heads, his eyes landing on Ava with a mixture of suspicion and something else, something colder, something that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with assumption. He took a step closer, slow, deliberate, as if the space between them belonged to him, and the room seemed to shift with it. Conversations quieted, glances exchanged, because everyone knew that tone, that posture, that moment when something small begins to turn into something else, something heavier. Ava didn't look away, didn't flinch. Her eyes met his with a calm that didn't challenge, but didn't submit either. And for a brief second, there was silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Then Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, like he had already decided the outcome. His words came out clipped, edged with disbelief, as if her presence alone required explanation. And still, she said nothing, not yet, because she understood something he didn't, something the entire room hadn't realized, that power isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly, waiting, watching, letting the moment build. And Daniel mistook that silence for weakness, the way people often do when they've never had their authority questioned. He moved closer again, his voice lower now, but more pointed, and the tension in the room tightened. Officers pretending not to watch while watching everything. The air itself felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. And if you were there, you would feel it too. That subtle shift, that invisible line being crossed. Ava finally spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle, but there was weight behind it, the kind that doesn't need volume to be heard. You might want to rethink this, she said, and for a split second, something flickered in Daniel's expression, something uncertain, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced by a confidence that had never failed him before, because in his world, moments like this always ended the same way, or at least, they always had, until now. Daniel's smile lingered just a second too long. The kind of smile that was not about humor, but about certainty, as if the outcome had already been written somewhere only he could see. And around them the station resumed its low murmur, officers shifting in place, papers sliding across desks, radios crackling faintly in the background. But beneath it all there was a tension that had not been there before, subtle but unmistakable, like the air before a storm that no one wanted to acknowledge. Ava did not move, did not adjust her posture or glance away. She simply watched him, steady and composed, and that stillness began to do something unexpected. It made the room uncomfortable, because people are used to reactions, to raised voices or quick defenses, something they can point to and justify what comes next, but she gave them none of that, and without it, the moment stretched, heavy and unresolved. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her now with more focus, as if trying to figure out why she was not responding the way he expected. His voice came again, slower this time, edged with impatience, questioning her presence, her purpose, her right to even be there, and each word landed in the space between them. But Ava remained unchanged, her breathing even, her gaze unwavering. And if you were standing close enough, you might notice the smallest detail, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the far end of the room, not in fear, not in distraction, but in quiet calculation, like she was measuring time instead of reacting to pressure. Daniel took another step forward, closing the gap until the distance between them felt almost symbolic, as if he needed to prove something not just to her, but to everyone watching, a silent demonstration of control. And a few officers nearby exchanged glances, the kind that say they have seen this before and know how it usually ends. One of them shifted his weight, almost as if he might say something, but then thought better of it, because in places like this, silence often feels safer than intervention, and that silence gave Daniel exactly what he needed, reinforcement without words. He straightened slightly, his tone sharpening, pressing her again, demanding answers that were less about information and more about authority. And still, Ava did not rise to it. She did not argue, did not explain. She simply let the moment exist, and that was the part no one understood, because while they were focused on what was happening in front of them, she was focused on something else entirely, something just out of view, the quiet rhythm of a plan already in motion, a sequence of events that had begun long before she walked through those doors. Her voice came again, softer now, but carrying the same weight. "This is not the moment you think it is," she said, and the words did not sound like a warning. They sounded like a statement, something already decided, and for the briefest second, the room shifted again, a pause, a hesitation that passed through the officers like a ripple. But Daniel dismissed it, brushing past the unease with the confidence of someone who had never been forced to question himself. He turned slightly, gesturing as if to move things forward, to take control of the situation in a more official way, but even that movement felt just a little off, just a fraction too late, because somewhere beyond the walls of that station, something had already begun to change, something that did not need to announce itself loudly to be felt, and Ava knew it. She could feel it in the timing, in the subtle shift of energy that no one else had noticed yet, and so she remained exactly where she was, calm, composed, waiting not for permission, but for the moment when everything they believed about this situation would quietly and completely turn against them. The room did not change all at once. It never does. It shifted in pieces, in glances, in the way conversations died a little quicker than before and footsteps slowed just enough to notice what was happening. Daniel moved toward the desk, his hand brushing against a stack of reports as if grounding himself in something familiar, something procedural, because procedure meant control, and control meant certainty. And certainty had always been on his side. He began speaking again, outlining what would happen next, his tone now more official, more rigid, as if wrapping the moment in rules could make it simpler, could make it smaller. But even as he spoke, there was something beneath it, something slightly off, like a rhythm that no longer matched the room. Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her attention was not on his words anymore. It was on the space around them. The subtle signals most people ignore, a flicker of movement near the entrance, a shadow passing across the frosted glass, the faintest shift in the hum of activity outside. And if you were paying close enough attention, you might have noticed it too, that almost imperceptible pause in the building itself, like something was about to enter, not with noise, but with presence. One of the younger officers glanced toward the hallway, his brow tightening for just a second before he quickly looked away, pretending nothing had caught his attention. But that single glance was enough, because it confirmed what Ava already knew. The timing was aligning, exactly as it should. Daniel turned back toward her, expecting compliance, expecting reaction, expecting something that would justify the next step. But instead he found the same calm, the same stillness, and this time it unsettled him just a little more than before. Not enough to stop, not enough to question, but enough to register somewhere beneath his confidence, like a crack too small to see but too real to ignore. "Last chance," he said, his voice firm, measured, as if offering her an opportunity she should be grateful for. But Ava did not take it. She simply held his gaze and said quietly, "You are already out of time." And the words landed differently now, not as defiance, not as resistance, but as fact. And for a brief second, Daniel hesitated. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there, the smallest break in his momentum. And then it happened, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through everything. The front doors of the station opened, the sound sharp against the low hum of the room, and footsteps followed, steady, deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain. The kind of footsteps that did not need permission to enter. Conversation stopped completely now, not because anyone told them to, but because something in those steps demanded attention. Officers turned, one by one, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something closer to recognition, and Daniel, still standing in the center of it all, felt it before he fully understood it. That shift in control, that quiet transfer of authority that no badge could override. Ava did not turn to look. She did not need to. Instead, for the first time since she had entered that room, the faintest change touched her expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, but confirmation, as if a clock had just struck the exact second she had been waiting for. And in that moment, the question was no longer about what she would do next. It was about what they had already done, and how quickly everything they believed about power was about to unravel. The footsteps did not rush. They did not echo with urgency. They carried something far more unsettling, certainty, the kind that does not ask for attention but commands it without a single word. And as those figures stepped fully into the light of the station, everything seemed to pause, not frozen, but recalibrating, like the room itself was trying to understand what had just entered it. 3 individuals in dark suits moved forward with quiet precision, their presence clean, composed, and unmistakably official. No raised voices, no aggressive gestures, just authority that did not need to prove itself. One of them, a tall man with a calm but unyielding expression, scanned the room briefly before his eyes settled exactly where they needed to be, on Ava. And in that moment, something invisible shifted completely, because the way he looked at her was not casual, not questioning. It was recognition, immediate and absolute. Daniel noticed it too, though he did not fully understand it yet. His posture stiffened slightly, his shoulders pulling back as if preparing to assert control again, to reclaim the space that suddenly felt less certain beneath his feet. He stepped forward, his voice cutting into the silence, asking questions, demanding identification, falling back on the structure he trusted, the badge, the protocol, the rules that had always placed him above situations like this. But the man did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket, not in a threatening way, not in a hurried motion, but with deliberate clarity. And when he pulled out the badge, it was not flashed dramatically. It was simply held at a level where it could be seen, federal credentials, unmistakable, undeniable. And for the first time, the room did not just feel tense, it felt divided. Lines being drawn in ways no one had expected. A quiet murmur spread through the officers, not loud, not chaotic, but enough to signal that something was no longer routine. Daniel's expression tightened, confusion flickering beneath his controlled exterior. He glanced at Ava, then back at the man, as if trying to piece together a narrative that no longer fit. And then the man spoke, his voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of someone used to being heard. "We are here for her," he said, and the words landed heavier than any command, because they did not just refer to Ava, they redefined her. In a single sentence, the entire context of the situation shifted, the assumptions, the judgments, the unspoken hierarchy. All of it began to unravel. Daniel let out a short breath, a sound that almost resembled a laugh. But it lacked confidence now. It was edged with disbelief, as if rejecting what was being implied was the only way to hold on to control. "For her," he repeated, his tone sharper, but beneath it, there was something new, something unfamiliar. Doubt. Ava finally moved. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough to change the balance of the moment. She stood, smooth and composed, her gaze steady as it met Daniel's one last time before shifting to the man who had just entered. And there was no surprise in her expression, no relief, only acknowledgement, like 2 pieces of the same plan aligning exactly as intended. The man gave a slight nod, respectful, precise, and then he said it, not loudly, not for effect, but clearly enough that every person in the room heard it. "Agent Carter." And just like that, the silence that followed was different from all the others. It was not tension, not anticipation, it was realization, slow and heavy, spreading across the room as understanding began to take hold. And Daniel stood there, in the center of it all, still holding on to a version of reality that was already slipping away, not because anyone had taken it from him, but because it had never truly belonged to him in the first place. The word did not echo. It did not need to. Agent settled into the room like a weight no one could ignore, and suddenly every detail that once seemed ordinary began to shift into something else entirely. The way Ava had stood without fear, the way she had chosen silence over defense, the way her eyes never searched for approval or escape, it all rewrote itself in the minds of those watching, and Daniel felt it happen in real time. The slow collapse of his assumptions, his jaw tightened, his eyes flicking between the federal agents and Ava as if trying to find a version of this moment that still made sense. But there was none. The narrative he had built was gone, replaced by something he did not control. One of the agents stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, not confrontational, but with a presence that made space without asking for it. His voice remained even, professional, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. This situation is now under federal jurisdiction, he said, and the words landed with quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. A few officers instinctively stepped back, their posture shifting, their alignment changing without instruction, because authority had just been redefined in front of them. Daniel inhaled slowly, as if steadying himself, and for the first time, he did not speak immediately. The delay was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a hesitation that had never belonged to him before. She did not identify herself, he finally said, his tone controlled but edged, as if searching for something procedural to hold on to, something that could justify what had already happened. Ava turned toward him fully now, her movement calm, deliberate, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same composure it always had, but now it held something more, something undeniable. "You did not ask," she said, and the simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any argument, because it removed everything unnecessary. It exposed the moment for exactly what it was, not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, but a choice, and around them, the room absorbed that truth in silence, the kind that does not argue, does not resist, just acknowledges. One of the younger officers lowered his gaze, another shifted uncomfortably, and even those who had remained neutral could no longer pretend this was routine. Daniel exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders no longer as squared as before, the confidence still present, but no longer untouched. "That still does not change protocol," he replied, but the words lacked the certainty they once had, because protocol without authority is just language, and the authority in this room had already moved. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where the line is, and who crossed it. "No," she said quietly. "It changes everything." And for the first time, Daniel did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because something inside the moment had already answered for him. The agents exchanged brief glances, subtle but meaningful, and one of them reached into his folder, pulling out documents that had been prepared long before this encounter ever began, papers that did not rush, did not threaten, but carried consequences nonetheless. And as they were placed onto the desk with quiet precision, the sound alone seemed louder than anything that had come before, not because of the noise, but because of what it meant. The shift was complete now, not sudden, not explosive, but irreversible, and standing there in the center of it all, Daniel began to understand something he had never needed to consider before. That power does not disappear. When challenged, it simply reveals who truly holds it, and in that moment, it was no longer him. The papers did not need to be explained. They did not need raised voices or dramatic gestures. They carried their own gravity, resting flat against the surface of the desk, yet somehow pressing down on the entire room. And as the top page shifted slightly under the air of the overhead vent, the seal stamped in the corner caught the light just enough to draw every eye toward it. Federal authorization, internal review orders, names that were not supposed to be seen outside certain circles now sitting openly in a local station that suddenly felt much smaller than it had just minutes ago. Daniel looked at them but did not reach out. Not yet. As if touching them would make everything irreversible. As if there was still a version of this moment where he could step back into control. But that version was already gone. One of the agents spoke again, his tone unchanged, steady, measured, but now carrying the quiet momentum of something already in motion. "This department has been under observation," he said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact that had existed long before this encounter. And a ripple moved through the officers, subtle but undeniable, a shift in posture, in breathing, in the way eyes avoided one another. Because suddenly this was no longer about one interaction, one moment. It was about something larger, something that had been building beneath the surface without their knowledge. Ava remained still, but now her presence filled the space differently, not as someone being questioned, but as someone who had been watching, documenting, understanding, and waiting. Her gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching, but confirming, recognizing details she had already memorized, patterns she had already traced, and then it settled again, calm and focused. Daniel finally reached for the top sheet, his fingers brushing the edge before lifting it slightly, his eyes scanning the lines, the language precise, clinical, leaving no room for interpretation. And as he read, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention immediately, but enough for those closest to him to notice that the certainty he had carried so easily was no longer intact. "This is not possible," he said quietly, almost to himself, and for the first time, his voice did not fill the room. It stayed close, contained, like it had nowhere else to go. The agent did not respond right away, allowing the words to settle, allowing Daniel to sit in the realization that was beginning to form, because this was not about convincing him. It was about letting him see what had always been there. Ava took a single step forward, not to confront, not to intimidate, but to close the distance just enough to be heard clearly, her voice calm, steady, carrying no anger, only truth. "It was already in motion before you walked in today," she said, and the simplicity of it stripped away any illusion that this moment had been created by chance. It had not started here. It had not started with him. It had only reached him. And that was the part that settled deepest, because it meant that everything he thought he understood about control, about authority, about who was being observed and who was doing the observing, had been reversed long before he ever noticed. The room stood in silence again. But this silence was different. It was not tension. It was exposure. And in that exposure, every person present began to feel the weight of being seen, not just in what they were doing now, but in what had been happening all along. And Daniel stood there, the paper still in his hand, no longer looking at Ava as someone he needed to manage, but as someone he had completely misunderstood. And somewhere in that realization, something shifted again, quieter this time, but just as final, because once you understand that you were never in control, there is no way to return to the moment before you knew. Daniel did not lower the paper right away, his eyes moving across the lines again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more familiar, something less final. But they did not change. They remained exactly as they were, precise, structured, undeniable. And around him the room had grown quieter than it had ever been, not out of discipline, not out of routine, but out of awareness, because everyone could feel it now. The shift had completed, the balance had tilted, and there was no returning to what it had been before. One of the agents stepped closer to the desk, not intruding, not aggressive, but firm in a way that left no space for negotiation, his hand resting lightly near the documents, a silent indication that they were no longer optional. Daniel finally set the paper down, slower than necessary, as if delaying the moment could somehow soften it. But the delay only made the weight of it more noticeable. His gaze lifted, moving from the documents back to Ava, and this time it was different. There was no assumption left in it, no judgment waiting to be confirmed, only the realization that he had been standing in the middle of something far larger than himself without ever seeing it. Ava held his gaze, not with satisfaction, not with any sense of victory, but with a calm that came from certainty, the kind that does not need to prove anything because it already knows. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer tense, but heavy with understanding. The agent broke it gently, his voice measured. "Officer Brooks, we are going to need you to step away from the desk," he said, not as a command shouted across a room, but as a direction that carried its own authority. And the difference mattered, because this was not about force, it was about transition. Daniel did not move immediately, not out of defiance, but because something inside him was still catching up, still trying to process how quickly everything had changed, how a situation he believed he controlled had unfolded into something entirely outside of him. His hands rested briefly on the edge of the desk, fingers tightening slightly before releasing. A small, almost imperceptible motion, but one that revealed more than any words could. He took a step back, just one, but it was enough. Enough to signal that the position he had held moments ago no longer belonged to him. And as he moved, the space around the desk seemed to reorganize, the agent stepping forward naturally, not rushing, not asserting dominance, simply occupying the role that had always been theirs. Ava watched it happen without comment, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but inside that stillness was a quiet completion, the final piece falling into place exactly as it had been intended. One of the officers near the back shifted uneasily. Another cleared his throat as if to speak, but stopped himself, because there was nothing to add, nothing to question, the clarity of. The moment left no room for interpretation. Daniel glanced around the room, taking in the faces that only minutes ago had mirrored his certainty, and now reflected something entirely different. Uncertainty, caution, distance, and it settled in him, not as shock, but as a slow, undeniable truth, that authority is not something you claim, it is something that can be taken the moment it is misused. Ava finally spoke again, her voice quiet but clear, carrying across the room without effort. This was never about a single moment, she said, and the words did not accuse. They explained, they reframed everything that had just happened into something larger, something that extended beyond this room, beyond this day, and Daniel understood. Maybe not every detail, not every layer of what had been uncovered, but enough to know that the story he had been telling himself was over, and in its place stood something far less comfortable, but far more real. And as the agents began their work with calm precision, the room no longer felt like a place of control. It felt like a place where control had been revealed for what it truly was, temporary, conditional, and never as secure as it once seemed. The movement in the room became quieter but more deliberate, not chaotic, not rushed, just precise, like every action had already been decided before it was carried out. Folders were opened, names were checked, quiet conversations between agents replaced the casual chatter that once filled the space, and for the officers standing along the walls, the shift was impossible to ignore, because what had once been familiar now felt distant, like they were watching their own environment from the outside for the first time. Daniel stood a few feet back from the desk, no longer at the center, no longer directing the flow, and that distance, small as it was, felt larger than anything that had happened so far. He watched as one of the agents carefully reviewed the documents again, cross-referencing details with a tablet, each motion calm, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed down to match the certainty of the process. And in that stillness, the reality settled deeper. This was not a disruption, it was a correction. Ava moved slightly to the side, giving the agents clear access to the desk, her presence now fully aligned with theirs, not separate, not questioned, but integrated into the authority that had taken hold of the room. And yet she did not assert herself, did not claim the moment. She simply stood with the same composure she had carried from the beginning, because she did not need to prove anything anymore. It had already been proven. Daniel's gaze followed her movement, not out of suspicion now, but out of something quieter, something closer to reflection. And if you were watching closely, you could see it, the shift in his understanding, not complete, not comfortable, but undeniable. He glanced again at the other officers, at the way they avoided eye contact, at how quickly they had stepped back once the agents arrived, and for the first time, he saw it clearly, the way authority had never really belonged to any one person, the way it could move, could change, could expose the difference between control and accountability. One of the agents closed the folder with a soft but final sound, the kind that signals the end of review and the beginning of consequence. And he turned slightly toward Daniel, not with hostility, not with judgment, but with the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly what comes next. "We will continue this process formally," he said, his voice even, leaving no room for misunderstanding. And Daniel nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried more weight than anything he had said earlier, because it was not agreement, it was acknowledgement. Ava watched that moment carefully, not to judge him, not to measure him, but to understand the shift that had taken place, because this was never about a single action. It was about what that action revealed, about the assumptions behind it, the patterns beneath it, the things that go unnoticed until they are placed under light. And now everything was under light: the room, the people, the system itself, and there was no way to dim it again. A quiet stillness settled once more, but it was no longer tense, no longer uncertain. It was resolve, the kind of stillness that comes after something has been uncovered and can no longer be hidden. And Ava finally turned her gaze away from Daniel, not because he no longer mattered, but because the moment between them had already said everything it needed to say. The lesson was no longer personal. It was structural, something larger than both of them. And as the agents prepared to move forward, the station no longer felt like a place of unchecked authority. It felt like a place where accountability had finally arrived, not loudly, not violently, but with a quiet force that could not be ignored. And in that silence, one truth stood clear above all the rest: power is not defined by who raises their voice, but by who remains standing when the truth is finally revealed. The station did not return to what it had been, not after something like that. Because once a truth is seen clearly, it does not disappear just because the moment has passed. It lingers in the silence, in the way people move, in the way they look at each other differently than before. And as the agents continued their work with quiet efficiency, the rhythm of the room changed permanently. Conversations no longer carried the same ease. Laughter no longer filled the same spaces. Everything felt measured now, observed, as if the very walls had learned something they could not forget. Daniel remained where he was, no longer resisting, no longer trying to reclaim anything, just standing in the aftermath of a reality that had unfolded without his permission. His eyes moved once more toward Ava, not searching for answers this time, but acknowledging something he had not understood before. That presence does not always announce itself. That authority does not always look the way he had been taught to recognize it. Ava met his gaze briefly, and in that moment, there was no hostility, no triumph, only clarity, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. She turned slightly, stepping away from the center of the room as the agents finalized their process, her role in this moment complete, not because the work was finished, but because the truth had already done what it needed to do. And as she moved, the space she left behind felt different, not empty, but changed, like something important had passed through it and reshaped everything it touched. Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more than just tension. It carried recognition, the kind that arrives too late to prevent a mistake, but just in time to understand it. And that understanding settled in quietly, without resistance, because there was nothing left to argue against. Around him, the officers stood in a new kind of stillness, not the stillness of routine, but the stillness of awareness, each of them processing in their own way what had just happened, what it meant, what it revealed, and what it would change moving forward. One of the agents closed the final folder, the sound soft but definitive, marking the end of this moment and the beginning of everything that would follow. And as they prepared to leave, their presence did not fade. It remained, not physically, but in the shift they had created, in the reminder they had left behind. Ava paused near the exit, just for a second, not to look back in regret, not to revisit what had happened, but to let the moment settle fully, to let the lesson take root where it needed to. And then she stepped forward, walking out of the station with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning, leaving behind a space that would never feel quite the same again. And if you were standing there, watching it all unfold, you would understand something simple, something undeniable, that the difference between power and justice is not in who speaks the loudest, but in who stands firm when everything else begins to fall away. Because in the end, he thought he was the law, but that day, the law had a new face.